The morning mist clung to the Rappahannock River like a shroud of death, and General Ambrose Burnside knew that thousands of men would not see another sunrise. It was December 11th, 1862, and the Army of the Potomac stood poised on the precipice of what would become one of the most catastrophic defeats in Union military history. Burnside paced nervously along the river bank, his distinctive whiskers trembling in the cold Virginia air. Just weeks earlier, President Abraham Lincoln had entrusted him with command of the Army of the Potomac, after relieving the overly cautious George McClellan. The weight of expectation pressed down upon his shoulders like a millstone. Lincoln demanded action, the Northern press cried for victory, and the approaching winter threatened to bog down military operations until spring. Across the fog-shrouded river, the ancient city of Fredericksburg lay eerily quiet. Its cobblestone streets, which had once echoed with the footsteps of George Washington's youth, now awaited the thunder of artillery and the screams of dying men. The city's residents had fled days earlier, leaving behind empty houses that would soon become fortresses and graveyards. Robert E. Lee, the Confederate commander whose tactical brilliance had already frustrated multiple Union generals, watched from the heights above Fredericksburg with calculating eyes. His Army of Northern Virginia had taken position along a 7-mile defensive line. On the high ground behind the city, Marye's Heights loomed like a natural fortress, its slopes offering perfect fields of fire for Confederate artillery and infantry. Lee's lieutenant, James Longstreet, had positioned his First Corps along these commanding heights, while Thomas Stonewall Jackson's Second Corps held the right flank near Hamilton's Crossing. The irony was not lost on Lee that he would defend Virginia's soil from the very hills where he had grown up, born just 30 miles from Fredericksburg. He knew every ridge, every creek, every advantage the terrain offered. His gray-clad soldiers had spent weeks preparing their positions, digging rifle pits, clearing fields of fire, and positioning artillery to create interlocking zones of death. Burnside's plan seemed straightforward enough on paper: cross the Rappahannock River, seize Fredericksburg, and then drive south toward Richmond, the Confederate capital. His army of 120,000 men vastly outnumbered Lee's 78,000, and Northern industrial might had equipped them with superior artillery and supplies. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. The pontoon bridges that were supposed to facilitate the river crossing had arrived late, giving Lee precious time to concentrate his forces and prepare his defenses. Now, as Burnside finally prepared to implement his assault, he faced not a surprised and scattered enemy, but a well-entrenched Confederate army holding the high ground. This account draws from detailed battlefield reports documented in the National Archives, as referenced in multiple Civil War historical studies. The sound of hammering echoed across the water as Union engineers worked frantically to complete the pontoon bridges under the cover of darkness. Confederate sharpshooters, hidden in the buildings of Fredericksburg, picked off the bridge builders with deadly precision. Each time a Union soldier fell into the icy water, another took his place, driven by duty and the knowledge that delay would only make their task more difficult. As dawn approached on December 11th, the stage was set for a tragedy of epic proportions. Burnside, despite growing doubts from his subordinate commanders, remained committed to his plan. He had promised Lincoln action, and action he would deliver. Regardless of the cost and blood, the thunder began at dawn. Union artillery, positioned on Stafford Heights across the river, opened a devastating bombardment on Fredericksburg that could be heard 20 miles away. 147 cannons roared in unison, their shells screaming across the Rappahannock, to explode among the city's buildings in showers of brick, timber, and flame. Colonel Henry Hunt, Burnside's chief of artillery, watched through his field glasses as the ancient city began to disintegrate under the barrage. Entire blocks vanished in clouds of smoke and debris. The bombardment was meant to drive out the Confederate sharpshooters, who had been harassing the bridge-building operations. But the rebels proved as stubborn as they were accurate. Despite the apocalyptic shelling, Mississippi riflemen under Brigadier General William Barksdale continued to fire from the ruins of Fredericksburg's buildings. These hardy soldiers, many of whom had been farmers and hunters before the war, possessed the marksmanship skills that made them deadly opponents in urban warfare. They darted from cellar to cellar, from one pile of rubble to another, making the Union engineers pay in blood for every plank they laid. Major General Edwin Sumner, commanding the Right Grand Division of Burnside's army, grew increasingly frustrated as the morning wore on. His 6th to 1st Massachusetts Infantry and other regiments stood ready to cross, but the bridges remained incomplete under the withering Confederate fire. Men who had marched hundreds of miles and survived numerous battles now found themselves pinned down by a relative handful of Southern marksmen. The solution, when it came, was as desperate as it was brave. Unable to complete the bridges under fire, Union commanders decided to send infantry across in the pontoon boats themselves. The 7th Michigan Infantry and the 19th Massachusetts Infantry volunteered for what amounted to a suicide mission. They would row across the river in broad daylight, under enemy fire, to establish a beachhead in Fredericksburg. The crossing began at noon. Small boats loaded with blue uniformed soldiers pushed off from the Union shore, while Confederate bullets whined overhead and splashed into the dark water. Many boats never reached the other side. Those that did disgorged their human cargo onto muddy shores already slick with blood. The Union soldiers who survived the crossing immediately began the deadly work of urban combat, fighting from house to house, room to room, against an enemy who knew every hiding place in the city. By evening, after hours of vicious street fighting, the Union forces had finally secured Fredericksburg. The cost had been terrible. Hundreds of casualties just to cross a river and take a city that Lee had never intended to defend seriously. The Confederate sharpshooters, having accomplished their mission of delaying the Union advance, withdrew in good order to join Lee's main force on the heights above. As night fell on December 11th, Burnside's army began crossing the completed pontoon bridges in earnest. Regiment after regiment tramped across the swaying spans. While their breath steamed in the frigid air, the men knew they were walking into a trap. But they were soldiers, and soldiers followed orders. The city of Fredericksburg lay in ruins around them. Elegant antebellum homes had been reduced to skeletal frameworks. The historic Kenmore plantation, once owned by George Washington's sister, bore the scars of artillery shells. Churches that had stood since colonial times now served as makeshift hospitals and shelters. Some Union soldiers, frustrated by the day's casualties and angry at the Confederate resistance, began looting the abandoned city. They smashed furniture, scattered books and papers, and helped themselves to whatever valuables remained. This breakdown in discipline would haunt the Union cause, providing Confederate propaganda with images of Northern vandalism and barbarism. Lee watched the crossing from his command post on Telegraph Hill, his weathered face showing no emotion. His plan was working perfectly. Let the Yankees cross the river. Let them occupy the city. When they advanced against his prepared positions on the high ground, he would give them a reception they would never forget. The night was filled with the sounds of an army preparing for battle, the jingle of harness, the clatter of artillery wheels on cobblestones, the low murmur of officers giving final instructions to their men. By morning, over 60,000 Union soldiers would be across the river, trapped between the Rappahannock at their backs and the Confederate Army to their front. December 13th, 1862, dawn clear and cold, with a biting wind that cut through uniforms and chilled men to the bone. As the sun rose over the Virginia hills, it illuminated one of the most lopsided battlefields in military history. The Union Army of the Potomac, now fully deployed on the Fredericksburg side of the Rappahannock, faced Confederate positions that seemed carved from solid rock. Marye's Heights dominated the landscape like a medieval fortress. The hill rose gradually from the city, then steepened dramatically into a series of ridges and terraces that provided perfect defensive positions. At the base of the heights, a stone wall ran along the sunken road, creating a natural rifle pit that could shelter thousands of Confederate infantry. Behind this wall, Longstreet had positioned the Washington artillery and other batteries, their cannons loaded with canister shot that would turn the approaching slope into a killing field. Burnside's battle plan, such as it was, called for simultaneous attacks on both flanks of Lee's line. Major General William Franklin would assault Jackson's corps on the Confederate right, near Hamilton's Crossing, while Sumner's and Joseph Hooker's Grand Divisions would strike Longstreet's positions on Marye's Heights. The plan looked reasonable on paper, but paper could not capture the deadly reality of attacking uphill against entrenched positions. Lee stood with Longstreet on Telegraph Hill, surveying the battlefield through field glasses. The Confederate commander had positioned his army with characteristic skill, placing each unit where it could do the most damage to the approaching enemy. Behind the stone wall at Marye's Heights, Georgian and North Carolinian regiments waited with loaded muskets. On the slopes above, Virginia and South Carolina batteries had their cannons trained on every possible avenue of approach. General Longstreet said to Lee, pointing toward the Union formations gathering in Fredericksburg, "We will slaughter them." Lee nodded grimly. He took no pleasure in the prospect of killing, but this was war, and his duty was to defend Virginia's soil against invasion. The first assault began at 11 in the morning. Franklin's left Grand Division advanced across the railroad tracks and open fields toward Jackson's positions near Hamilton's Crossing. The attack showed initial promise as Union troops broke through the Confederate front line and threatened to create a significant breach in Lee's right flank. Brigadier General George Meade's Pennsylvania Division smashed through a gap in Jackson's line, driving back startled Confederate defenders and capturing several cannons. For a brief moment, it appeared that the Union might achieve a breakthrough that could unravel Lee's entire position. Confederate officers shouted orders as their men fell back in apparent disorder, but Jackson had not earned his nickname Stonewall by accident. The old Virginia Military Institute professor quickly organized a counterattack, bringing up reserves and artillery to seal the breach. Confederate brigades struck Meade's exposed flanks with savage fury, driving the Pennsylvania troops back across the railroad tracks and into the open fields where they had started. The repulse of Franklin's attack was swift and decisive. Within 2 hours, the Union left Grand Division had been thrown back with heavy casualties, their brief success erased by Jackson's tactical skill and the fighting quality of his veteran troops. Franklin, shaken by the failure of his assault, made no further serious attempts to break through Jackson's line, with his left flank attack stalled. Burnside now pinned his hopes on the assault against Marye's Heights. This attack would be led by Sumner's right Grand Division, supported by Hooker's center Grand Division. The plan called for repeated frontal assaults up the slope toward the Confederate positions, with each wave supposed to weaken the enemy defenses until a breakthrough could be achieved. Drawing from battlefield correspondence preserved in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, these tactical movements have been documented extensively by military historians. The first wave of the assault began at noon. Brigadier General Nathan Kimball's brigade of the 2nd Corps stepped off from Fredericksburg streets and began advancing across the open ground toward Marye's Heights. The men moved in perfect formation, their bayonets gleaming in the winter sun, their battle flags snapping in the cold wind. They had advanced barely to 100 yards when the Confederate artillery opened fire. The sound was like thunder multiplied 100-fold. Shells screamed overhead and exploded in the Union ranks, sending men and equipment flying through the air. The careful formations began to waver as soldiers instinctively sought cover. That did not exist on the open slope, but these were veteran troops, hardened by 2 years of war, and they pressed forward despite the artillery fire. As they approached the stone wall at the base of Marye's Heights, Confederate infantry rose from their positions and delivered a devastating volley. The wall erupted in flame and smoke as thousands of muskets fired in unison. The first wave melted away like snow in spring rain. The stone wall that ran along the sunken road below Marye's Heights had been built decades earlier by local farmers to mark property boundaries and contain livestock. On December 13, 1862, it became the most deadly landmark in America. Behind its rough-hewn stones, for deep ranks of Confederate infantry waited with loaded muskets, while artillery position on the heights above had every yard of the approaching slope pre-sighted. For maximum destruction, Brigadier General Thomas Cobb's Georgia Brigade held the wall itself, their battle-hardened veterans lying prone behind, the stones with their rifle barrels resting on the irregular surface behind them. Additional Confederate regiments waited in reserve, ready to step forward when their front rank needed to reload. The system created a continuous cycle of death. As one rank fired, another took their place, maintaining constant fire on any Union force brave enough or foolish enough to advance up the slope. The second wave of Union attackers formed up in Fredericksburg streets as the survivors of Kimball's brigade stumbled back through their ranks. These men could see the carnage ahead of them, the slope littered with blue uniformed bodies, the wounded crawling desperately toward the rear, the steam rising from pools of blood in the cold air. Yet when the order came to advance, they stepped forward with the grim determination that characterized Civil War soldiers. Brigadier General John Andrews' brigade of the 2nd Corps emerged from the city and began their advance at 1 o'clock. They had watched Kimball's men get slaughtered, but military discipline and the faint hope that this time might be different drove them forward across the deadly ground. The Confederate artillery, which had temporarily ceased firing to avoid hitting their own men during the first assault, resumed their bombardment with renewed fury. Colonel Edward Cross, commanding the 5th New Hampshire Infantry, led his men up the slope with a fatalistic courage that impressed even his enemies. Cross knew he was marching toward almost certain death, but he had sworn an oath to his country and his men, and he would not break it now. His regiment advanced steadily despite the artillery fire, their ranks closing up automatically as shells tore gaps in their formation. As Andrews' brigade approached the stone wall, the Georgia defenders rose like an unstoppable force of nature. Their volley crashed across the slope with mechanical precision, and the second Union wave collapsed just as completely as the first. Andrews himself fell mortally wounded, and Cross took a bullet through the body that would eventually kill him, though he continued to command his regiment for several more minutes before collapsing. Burnside, watching the disaster unfold from his command post across the river, seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of the failure. His subordinate commanders begged him to call off the attacks, but the Union general had staked his reputation and his career on taking Fredericksburg. He could not accept that his plan had failed so catastrophically, so he ordered more assaults. The 3rd wave advanced at 2 o'clock, the 4th at 3, the 5th, 6th, and 7th waves followed at regular intervals throughout the afternoon, each one meeting the same fate as its predecessors. Union regiments that had fought with distinction at Antietam, Bull Run, and the peninsula now found themselves fed piecemeal into a meat grinder that consumed entire brigades in minutes. By 4 o'clock, the slope below Mary's Heights resembled a charnel house. Bodies lay stacked 3 and 4 deep in some places. The wounded moaned and cried for help, but no rescue was possible under the constant Confederate fire. Some Union soldiers tried to use the corpses of their comrades as breastworks, but even this desperate expedient provided little protection against the deadly accuracy of the Georgian marksmen. Irish Brigade Commander Brigadier General Thomas Marr watched his men prepare for their assault with tears in his eyes. The brigade, composed primarily of Irish immigrants from New York, had already suffered terrible casualties in previous battles. Now they faced annihilation on a Virginia hillside, far from the emerald fields of their homeland. The men fixed sprigs of boxwood to their caps in place of the traditional shamrock. There were no shamrocks in Virginia in December. The Irish Brigade's attack began at 3:30 in the afternoon. They advanced up the slope with their green battle flag flying proudly above them, singing traditional Irish war songs as Confederate bullets whistled around their ears. For a few miraculous moments, it seemed as though their courage might carry them to the stone wall. They advanced farther than any previous assault, coming within yards of the Confederate position. Then the Georgia infantry rose and delivered another of their devastating volleys. The Irish Brigade disintegrated in a cloud of smoke and blood. Of the 1,200 men who had begun the advance, only 280 remained standing when the survivors retreated back down the slope. Marr himself was carried from the field unconscious. Though whether from wounds or alcohol remained a matter of debate, these casualty figures and tactical details are documented in regimental histories and official reports archived at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. As darkness began to fall, Burnside finally accepted that his attacks had failed. 14 separate assaults had been launched against Mary's Heights, and all 14 had been repulsed with horrific casualties. The Union Army had lost over 12,000 men in a single day, while Confederate losses numbered less than 5,000. The stone wall that had protected Cobb's Georgians remained intact, though it was now slick with blood and pockmarked by bullet strikes. Behind it, Confederate soldiers who had fired hundreds of rounds sat exhausted but victorious, their musket barrels too hot to touch. They had witnessed slaughter on a scale that sickened even veteran warriors. As night fell over the battlefield, the cries of the wounded filled the cold December air. Between the lines, in that terrible no-man's land below Mary's Heights, thousands of Union soldiers lay dying in the darkness, forgotten by generals who had already begun planning their next futile assault. The temperature dropped below freezing as darkness enveloped the battlefield, and the cries of the wounded created a symphony of suffering that haunted both armies. Throughout the long December night, between the lines, in the deadly strip of ground below Mary's Heights, thousands of Union soldiers lay scattered like broken dolls, some dead, others clinging to life with desperate determination. Sergeant Richard Kirkland of the 2nd South Carolina Infantry could no longer bear the sounds drifting up from the slope. The 19-year-old soldier, nicknamed the Angel of Mary's Heights by his comrades, had spent the day firing into Union ranks with mechanical efficiency. Now, as he listened to enemy soldiers crying for water and calling for their mothers, His humanity overcame his military training. "General, I can't stand it any longer," Kirkland told his brigade commander, Brigadier General Joseph Kershaw. "Those poor fellows out there are suffering terribly. I want to go out and give them water." Kershaw initially refused, fearing that Union sharpshooters would shoot Kirkland the moment he appeared above the stone wall. But the young sergeant's persistence eventually wore down his commander's resistance. Kirkland gathered every canteen he could find and climbed over the stone wall shortly after midnight. Union soldiers, seeing a Confederate uniform approaching in the darkness, initially raised their rifles in alarm. But when they realized Kirkland's peaceful intent, word spread quickly through the wounded ranks. The South Carolina sergeants bent the next arm, moving from man to man, giving water to Union soldiers and covering the wounded with blankets he had taken from Confederate dead. The spontaneous truce that developed around Kirkland's mercy mission highlighted the complex nature of the Civil War, where enemies could demonstrate profound humanity even in the midst of barbaric slaughter. Union soldiers blessed the young Confederate who had risked his life to ease their suffering, while Confederate officers on both sides of the line quietly agreed to hold their fire. Meanwhile, in Fredericksburg, Union generals struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their defeat. Major General Joseph Hooker, whose Center Grand Division had been held in reserve during most of the day's fighting, met with Burnside and other corps commanders to discuss their options. The mood in the hastily established headquarters was one of stunned disbelief. "We must renew the attack tomorrow," Burnside insisted, his voice hollow with exhaustion and denial. The men came close to breaking through several times. "One more push will carry the position." His subordinates exchanged worried glances. They had witnessed the same battle as their commanding general, but apparently they had seen something entirely different. Brigadier General Andrew Humphreys, whose Pennsylvania division had been among the last to assault Marye's Heights, spoke with barely controlled anger. "General Burnside, sir, with respect, we did not come close to breaking through. We were slaughtered like sheep. My division lost 60% of its strength in less than an hour. There is no position to carry, only death waiting on that slope." The debate continued through the night, but Burnside remained adamant. He had promised President Lincoln aggressive action against Lee's army, and he intended to deliver on that promise regardless of the cost. His reputation, his career, and perhaps the entire Union war effort depended on achieving some kind of victory at Fredericksburg. On the Confederate side, Lee held his own council of war on Telegraph Hill. Unlike his Union counterpart, the Confederate commander felt no need to justify failed attacks or salvage personal reputation. His army had performed magnificently, inflicting a devastating defeat on a superior enemy force while suffering minimal casualties. Themselves, "Gentlemen," Lee addressed his corps commanders, "the enemy has been bloodied, but not broken. We must remain vigilant. Burnside may attempt to renew his attacks tomorrow, or he may try to withdraw across the river. Either way, we must be prepared to respond appropriately." Longstreet and Jackson nodded their agreement, though both generals privately doubted that even Burnside would be foolish enough to repeat the day's disasters. Contemporary accounts of these command conferences are preserved in the memoirs of participants, as documented by the Virginia Historical Society. Throughout the Union camps in Fredericksburg, the mood was one of barely controlled despair. Veteran regiments that had entered the battle with full ranks now huddled around small fires, their numbers decimated by the day's fighting. The Second Corps had been particularly hard hit, losing almost 4,000 men in the repeated assaults against Marye's Heights. Officers moved through the camps, trying to maintain morale and discipline among men who had watched their comrades die in futile charges against impregnable positions. Many soldiers wrote what they believed would be their final letters home, knowing that morning would likely bring more suicidal attacks. Against the Confederate stronghold, Private William Smith of the 19th Massachusetts Infantry sat by a dying fire, staring at the slope where so many of his friends had perished. He had volunteered to fight for the Union, believing in the cause of preserving the nation and ending slavery. Now, after watching wave after wave of brave men die for no apparent purpose, he wondered if any cause was worth such slaughter. "They're going to send us up there again tomorrow," Smith whispered to his tent mate. "And we're going to die just like all the others. For what? So General Burnside doesn't have to admit he was wrong?" The sentiment was shared by thousands of other Union soldiers throughout the camps. Though few dared voice their doubts so openly, the night was filled with the sounds of suffering, the moans of wounded men, the prayers of chaplains administering last rites, the quiet sobbing of soldiers who had reached their emotional breaking point. Ambulance corps workers moved constantly between the hospitals and the battlefield, bringing in wounded men and carrying out the dead dot in the Confederate camps on the heights above. The mood was markedly different. Lee's soldiers had achieved a complete tactical victory, inflicting enormous casualties while suffering relatively few themselves. They had proven once again that Southern fighting men, properly positioned and led, could defeat any number of Yankees. Yet even in victory, many Confederate soldiers felt sickened by the slaughter they had witnessed. These were Americans killing Americans, and the scale of the carnage at Fredericksburg exceeded anything previously seen in the war. Veterans who had fought at Bull Run, Seven Pines, and Antietam struggled to comprehend the mechanical efficiency with which they had destroyed entire Union brigades. As dawn approached on December 14th, both armies prepared for what many believed would be the final act of the Fredericksburg tragedy. Union soldiers fixed bayonets and checked their ammunition, while Confederate defenders ensured their rifles were clean and their powder dry. The stone wall waited silently, still stained with the previous day's blood, ready to receive another harvest of death. Dawn broke gray and cold on December 14th, 1862, revealing a battlefield transformed into a landscape of horror. The slope below Mary's Heights was carpeted with Union dead, their blue uniforms creating a grim pattern against the frost-covered grass. Steam rose from the bodies in the frigid morning air, creating an ethereal mist that seemed to carry the souls of the departed toward heaven. General Burnside stood at his headquarters window in the Lacey House, staring across the Rappahannock at the scene of his army's destruction. His grand plan to capture Richmond and end the war had become a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Yet still he could not bring himself to admit complete defeat. Throughout the night, he had insisted to his staff that one final assault might yet break through Lee's lines and salvage victory from disaster. Sir Major General Edwin Sumner approached his commanding general with obvious reluctance. The men cannot take another assault on those heights. They are brave soldiers, but they are not miracle workers. That stone wall might as well be the gates of hell itself. Sumner was a veteran of 40 years of military service, and he had never seen anything to compare with the previous day's slaughter. Burnside turned from the window, his eyes red with exhaustion and unshed tears. General Sumner, I intend to lead the next assault personally. If the men see their commanding general sharing their danger, perhaps they will find the courage to carry the position. The declaration stunned everyone in the room. While Civil War generals occasionally exposed themselves to enemy fire, the idea of an army commander leading a suicidal frontal assault was unprecedented. Major General Joseph Hooker stepped forward, his face grave with concern. General, with all due respect, that would be an act of suicide, not leadership. Your death would accomplish nothing except to complete the destruction of this army. We must face reality. Fredericksburg cannot be taken by direct assault. The debate that followed was heated but brief. Burnside's subordinate commanders, supported by his own staff officers, eventually convinced him that leading a personal charge would be an empty gesture that would only add his name to the casualty lists. Reluctantly, the Union commander agreed to abandon his plan, though he still refused to order a general withdrawal. Lee, observing the Union camps through his field glasses, could see the demoralization that gripped Burnside's army. Confederate scouts reported that many Union regiments were in near mutinous condition, with soldiers openly questioning their officers' sanity. The Confederate commander recognized that his enemy was beaten, not just tactically but psychologically. General Jackson, Lee said to his subordinate, I believe General Burnside has learned his lesson. He will not renew his attacks today. Jackson, whose own corps had repulsed Franklin's assault on the Confederate right, nodded his agreement. The taciturn Valley commander had observed enough Union defeats to recognize the signs of a broken army. Throughout December 14th, an unofficial truce developed along the battle lines. Union soldiers ventured onto the slope to retrieve their wounded comrades, while Confederate defenders allowed these mercy missions to proceed without interference. The sight of Federal stretcher-bearers moving among the carnage created one of the war's most poignant images. Enemies showing humanity in the aftermath of inhuman slaughter. Sergeant Kirkland of the 2nd South Carolina continued his work among the Union wounded, now openly assisted by soldiers from both armies. His actions had inspired others to similar mercy, and soon Confederate and Union medical personnel were working side by side to save lives. The temporary brotherhood forged by shared compassion provided a stark contrast to the previous day's violence. This information about the informal truces and medical cooperation is documented in soldier diaries and letters held at the Museum of the Confederacy. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, the Union Army's medical director, struggled to cope with the overwhelming number of casualties. His innovative ambulance system, which had worked reasonably well in previous battles, was completely overwhelmed by the scale of the Fredericksburg disaster. Every available building in the city had been converted into a hospital, but still, there were not enough beds, surgeons, or medical supplies to treat all the wounded. The Lacey House, which served as Burnside's headquarters, was surrounded by wounded soldiers lying on stretchers in the freezing December air. Many would die from exposure before they could receive proper medical attention. The scene was repeated throughout Fredericksburg, where churches, schools, and private homes overflowed with casualties from the previous day's fighting. Among the Confederate positions, the mood remained subdued despite their overwhelming victory. General Cobb, whose Georgia Brigade had held the stone wall throughout the Union assaults, had been mortally wounded by a Union sharpshooter during the final attacks. His death cast a shadow over the Confederate celebration, reminding Lee's soldiers that even in victory, war extracted its price in blood. Longstreet surveyed the battlefield from his command post on Marye's Heights, his weathered face showing no satisfaction despite the tactical triumph. "I'd have never seen anything so one-sided," he confided to his staff. "We destroyed them utterly, yet I take no pleasure in it. These were brave men who died because their generals sent them against impossible positions." The afternoon brought disturbing news from Union signal stations across the river. Confederate scouts reported seeing large numbers of pontoon boats being assembled near the existing bridges, suggesting that Burnside might finally be preparing to withdraw his shattered army back across the Rappahannock. Lee immediately ordered increased vigilance, knowing that a retreating enemy could still be dangerous if cornered. As evening approached, both armies settled into an uneasy quiet. The Union soldiers who had survived the Fredericksburg massacre huddled in their camps, wondering if they would live to see another sunrise. The Confederate defenders remained at their posts, ready to repel any final desperate attack that their defeated enemy might attempt. But Burnside had finally accepted reality. As darkness fell on December 14th, he issued orders for his army to begin withdrawing across the Rappahannock under cover of night. The Battle of Fredericksburg was over, and the Union had suffered one of the most complete defeats in American military history. The stone wall below Marye's Heights stood intact, its rough stones now part of Civil War legend. Behind it, Confederate soldiers who had witnessed unprecedented slaughter cleaned their rifles and tried to forget the sounds of dying men. Above it, the heights themselves seemed to brood over the battlefield like silent sentinels, bearing witness to the folly of sending brave soldiers against impregnable positions. The withdrawal began at midnight on December 15th, 1862, as thousands of defeated Union soldiers filed silently across the pontoon bridges that had carried them to disaster just for days earlier. The retreat was conducted with remarkable efficiency, considering the demoralized state of Burnside's army. Strict orders maintained silence, and Confederate pickets across the battlefield heard only the muffled sounds of boots on wooden planks and the occasional creak of wagon wheels. Major General Henry Hunt's artillery was among the first to cross. The massive guns that had bombarded Fredericksburg so furiously now withdrawing in defeat. The gunners who had expended thousands of rounds in futile attempts to suppress Confederate positions now faced the humiliating task of removing their pieces from a battlefield they had failed to win. Many of the cannon showed damage from Confederate counter-battery fire, their bronze barrels scarred and their carriages splintered. The retreat was a masterpiece of military organization that stood in stark contrast to the tactical disasters of the previous days. Burnside's staff, working with the competence they had failed to display during the battle itself, coordinated the movement of over 100,000 men and their equipment across the narrow bridges. Engineers maintained the pontoon spans under increasingly difficult conditions as ice began forming on the Rappahannock surface. Lee, alerted to the withdrawal by his scouts, chose not to interfere with Burnside's retreat. The Confederate commander had achieved his strategic objectives: the defense of Richmond and the destruction of another Union army's fighting capacity. Attacking the retreating Federals would only result in unnecessary casualties among his own men, and Lee was too skilled a general to throw away advantages already won. "Let them go," Lee told Longstreet as reports of the Union withdrawal reached Confederate headquarters. "We have taught them a lesson they will not soon forget." There is no need to pursue a beaten enemy when doing so might cost us men we cannot afford to lose. The decision reflected Lee's growing awareness that the Confederacy's limited manpower required careful conservation. The last Union soldier crossed the Rappahannock at dawn on December 16th, and engineers immediately began dismantling the pontoon bridges. As the spans disappeared into the icy water, they took with them the last physical connection between the armies. The Battle of Fredericksburg was officially over, leaving behind a legacy of tactical lessons that would influence military thinking. For generations, Burnside's casualties were staggering, over 12,600 killed, wounded, and missing. By contrast, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had suffered fewer than 5,000 casualties. The disparity reflected not just poor Union generalship, but the enormous advantages enjoyed by defenders holding strong positions against frontal assaults. The lesson should have been obvious, but it would be repeated with similar results at other Civil War battlefields. The political ramifications of the defeat reverberated immediately through Washington. President Lincoln, who had appointed Burnside specifically to provide more aggressive leadership than McClellan, now faced the collapse of his latest military strategy. The radical Republicans in Congress, already critical of Lincoln's conduct of the war, demanded investigations and changes in command structure. These casualty figures and political responses are documented in contemporary newspaper accounts and congressional records as preserved in the Lincoln Papers at the Library of Congress. In the Union camps across the river, the mood was one of profound oppression and growing anger. Soldiers who had enlisted to preserve the Union and free the slaves now questioned whether their sacrifices served any purpose beyond advancing the careers of incompetent generals. Desertion rates, already a serious problem, increased dramatically. In the weeks following Fredericksburg, Private James Robertson of the